all, thank you for joining us. It's really good to be here. I'm really pleased to be here for this discussion about, I guess, Labour's approach to governance and statecraft. So my name's Emily Robinson. I'm an academic at the University of Sussex. And we're going to be discussing a paper, discussing beforehand whether or not it's the official launch of the paper. We think maybe it is, Governing for Change, written by John Wilson and John Denham, who I will introduce to you in a moment. So, I mean, they will introduce the paper, but basically it's a sort of the outcome of discussions, I think, over about the past year, affiliated with, but not necessarily entirely coming out of the Labour Together discussions, which are already also being sort of launched this week. So I think, you know, they'll say a little bit more about the paper in a moment. But first, I'll just introduce them and also our other two speakers, our respondents. So, I mean, you probably already know, but John Wilson is Professor of Modern History at King's College London. John Denham is Director of the Centre for English Identity and Politics at the University of Southampton, also former Labour Minister. And we have two great respondents, Jessica Studdart, Deputy Chief Executive of New Local, and Philip Roycroft, who until very recently was the Cabinet official responsible for intra-union relations. So I think we'll have a really great perspective on some of the things we're going to hear about. So I'm going to hand over to our speakers now. John and John will speak for about 15 minutes, maybe up to 20 minutes between them. And then I'm going to give Jessica and Philip about 10 minutes each, which will leave us about half an hour for discussion and questions afterwards. I'm going to have to sneak off just before the end of that because I'm teaching shortly. But hopefully we will get time for lots of questions before that. Okay, so without any further ado, over to you, John.
Thank you, and thanks everyone. And I'm going to share my screen if I can. I'm having problems sharing my screen. Sorry, 1 second. Oops. I'm having problems sharing my screen. Sophie, would you mind?
Yeah, of course, I can share it instead.
That'd be okay. Sorry about that. My apologies.
Yeah, of course.
Everything was working before. Thanks to everybody for being here, and thanks to Emily for kind of introducing us, and to Philip and Jessica for their comments in a moment. And it's been a real pleasure to work with John, kind of putting together the ideas that that we're going to be talking about, you know, sort of over the next half an hour or so. Just to say that this is, as Emily said, this has been work that John and I have developed out of a broader discussion with about 10 or so people on a sort of steering group that Philip's been part of, and that Jess has been an interlocutor with, you know, kind of thinking about, you know, kind of how we govern Britain, and how Labour approaches governing Britain. And we're extremely grateful to that kind of broader group of people who include sort of former Labour politicians, academics. I was about to say former bureaucrats. That's a mean word, but we have former esteemed members of the civil service. I must not use the word bureaucrat. So I'm going to kind of kick off, sort of introducing the paper, and then John's going to kind of continue in 10 minutes or so. And I wanted to start by the kind of first slide. Sorry, I'm going to have to that, you know, to say that we don't need now, given where we are politically, to talk about the problems and, if you like, the failures of modern Britain. We live in an unequal society, one of the most unequal sort of quote unquote developed countries there are, a society in which there is poverty, you know, kind of on a scale that I think many of us would have not expected, you know, kind of when we were much younger, a society which has public services which seem to be very good at delivering vaccines but nothing else, and you know, the vaccination has been a success story, but you know, kind of this is a state that's been incapable of organising PPE. It's been a state that's been, you know, thinking of COVID, incapable of protecting people in care homes, you know, is incapable of coordinating the economy in a way that leads to kind of productive outcomes for all sections of the country. We, relatively to other countries, we're a society that has kind of low productivity, And some of the and what's important is many of these problems kind of map themselves territorially, and I think we live in a political culture that is marked by grievance, inequality, sense of injustice mapped onto place in particular. And we talk about left behind areas, red wall seats. There's the politics of nationalism in Wales and Scotland, and Northern Ireland is kind of driven by that sense of grievance. But it's cross UK wide. And those kind of grievances kind of threaten to undo our polity and kind of lead to the abolition of the UK. And of course, there's a lack of trust in institutions and leadership. Now, from a Labour perspective, in a sense, now it's not easy to find people to blame, and the voters are beginning to, if you look at the opinion polls, kind of to share the sense within kind of that the Labour has had for a while about where one might lay the blame. Next slide, if that's okay. So and obviously we have kind of a prime minister and a government that's kind of that is decreasingly popular. Can you the next slide? But in a sense, what our argument is that things are more complicated, and that in a sense there's a danger. I mean, this is something that perhaps a year ago, 6 months ago, one might not imagine oneself saying, but there's a danger in the kind of current collapse of Conservative Party support, and it allows Labour to simply think that it can carry on as it has been. We can sort of move in, if you like, to the sort of government and state as it is, and we just need better people, kind of people, political leaders who are more serious and less absurd than Boris Johnson, and there's a danger that the possibility of electoral success over the next 6 months, year, leads to a refusal and a failure to kind of really think hard about why Britain is in such a mess, and what the problems in not just the kind of characters who our current system of government leads to ruling our politics, but in that system of government itself. Our argument is we need a better analysis and a better answer to the problem of government in the UK. The next slide, if that's okay. So let's kind of summarize where we are in terms of the system of government that we live in. Since the Second World War, there was a British state that coordinated what was seen at the time as a kind of relatively homogenous British nation. That there was a sense of a kind of national economy that was ruled, particularly consisted of sort of large-scale enterprise. That was the sort of normative, big factories, big companies, state or private sector. And that was kind of what the post-war state was built to manage. But it failed to kind of sort of to deal with the kind of tensions that grew from the 1960s, and the 1970s we can debate in all sorts of ways. But it was a decade of tension, industrial strife, social tension, and so forth. And if you like, the kind of the answer that emerged to the crisis of the British state in the 1980s was in the 1970s. Sorry, was for the state to focus on much less, and we ended up with but in a sense to be centralized, or to continue being centralized, or to be more centralized. And so since since the 80s, since the 90s, we've had a central state that is good for some of the things it was concerned, it was interested in doing: financialization, privatization, kind of sort of managing the relationship with what was seen as a benign global economy, and sort of and not that much more than that. Sort of redistributing the proceeds of growth, if anything. Post crash, post Brexit, post kind of the many crises that have occurred globally and nationally in the last kind of decade or more, it's become apparent that we need the state as it is doesn't work, and hasn't been able to meet the needs that certainly a Labour government would have for it. And in particular, the challenges to have institutions that exist across the UK, and by institutions I mean schools, hospitals, health institutions, kind of businesses, kind of public and private sector, and so on, and also local government and governments more broadly, but that are empowered, because we're not going to be able to kind of to meet the enormous social challenges that Britain faces unless there's a sense of institutions throughout the UK having their own agenda, being able to kind of solve problems, being resourceful and being able to and responsive, you know, kind of and based against their own constituencies. But at the same time, coordinated. There needs to be coordination across the different scales of the UK, because some of the challenges that we face, all of the challenges that we face in Britain and more globally, require a connection, whether it's climate change, whether it's engaging with the global economy and so forth. And our argument is that kind of central government today is just kind of incredibly ill-suited to kind of lead a state, to lead a polity that consists of empowered local institutions that are effectively coordinated across the UK to meet the challenges that we need to face. Next slide. So right now we have, you know, very weak, limited local government capacity. Local government wants to do more, but is limited. You know, it's over dependent on property-based growth most of the time, whether that's kind of, you know, Greenwich, where I live, or Manchester, and places that are not capable of leading property-based growth sink and don't have resources. There's a lack of clarity about the kind of powers that places have, you know, kind of nations and nations, regions, localities, that, you know, kind of the government's approach to devolution is just through a whole series of deals, rather than any kind of any broader holistic approach. And there's poor coordination and confusion in the relationship between the centre, nations and localities. And, you know, in England, in one of our 4 nations, there's no machinery of government. The problem, and I'll hand over to John in a moment, but the problem in a sense is because, and our argument is that we fail to recognise the kind of polity that the UK actually is now. Next slide. That, you know, we imagine that we live in this sort of, or the central government imagines it lives in this homogenous unitary nation state in which you don't need to distinguish between powers that exist in different places. But that's not the reality of how actually most people, most citizens, experience life. The UK is a union of multiple places, you know, kind of both, whether that's localities, towns, or nations, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, England. And it's a union based upon common interest and consent, you know, kind of rather than on simply kind of the centre effectively being able to tell everyone else what to do. So this is a polity that's made up, our central point is it's made up of many different centres of power and authority, which each have their own forms of democratic legitimacy and accountability. We forget about local elections are important, national elections kind of in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, etc. are important. And the role of central government there needs to be to lead, to empower, to lead, to coordinate and to broker relations between the kind of constituent parts of the polity at different scales. But it's not effective if it simply imposes its will against them, you know, kind of all the time. There needs to be leadership, there needs to be coordination, but simply not imagining that those kind of local centres of power and national centres of power don't exist is just leads continually to failure, and that's where we are now. And was I going to hand over to you, John, there, or is it the next?
I can take over if you want, John.
Well, I've lost count of which slide we're on.
Okay, Sophie, can you carry on doing the slides? That's great. Save me messing around.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me talk now about how Labour responds to these points. And thank you for that, John, and everybody else who's on this call. The first thing is Labour organises across the nations on the Isle of Britain. It ought to have consistent principles. If you think for a moment, though, that Scottish Labour is Scottish unionist, that does not play that much to ideas of Scottish nationhood. Welsh Labour is distinctly Welsh, playing very strongly to the idea of Welsh nationhood. Scottish Labour is in favour of the union. Welsh Labour says the union cannot carry on as it is at the moment. And in England, where the Labour Party is called UK Labour, it barely mentions England as a nation or engages in any discussion about the union whatsoever. Labour can't actually continue, I think, as a party that has such different approaches to nationhood, national democracy, the union and identity as we have at the moment. And we need a way of approaching our politics and the statecraft that weaves together the fact that people live in places, have a sense of belonging, that state power needs to be distributed, and that we have we all have a level at which we belong to a place, to a nation, and the union as a whole. So, next slide, please, Sophie. What we draw out in our paper is that once you recognize that power is dispersed across lots of institutions and lots of places, you have to be committed to political pluralism. You can't avoid it. This is not an argument in this instance about electoral reform or electoral justice, but simply a recognition that power is going to be legitimately held by different people in different places. To put it simply, what Labour's Andy Burnham might want for Greater Manchester has to be something that the Conservatives' Andy Street is entitled to for the West Midlands as well. And without dispersing power, it will be impossible truly to reform economic and social policy across the Union. But as John has said, reform cannot simply be about devolution. Without effective coordination between devolved institutions, national government and the UK government, challenges like the zero carbon economy, the post-Brexit economy will be impossible. And pluralism that is essential, a respect for all those who hold power, is key to building a shared story about renewal. And in part, this is about dropping its winner takes all mindset. When Labour says the road to power lies through Scotland, it not only conjures up the unfortunate idea that the historic role of Scottish Labour is to put Labour into the Scottish voters is to put Labour into power in Westminster, but also the idea that power really should lie in London and in Westminster. So politics will continue around real differences of values and opinion, but government also needs to work with all those who win. But next slide, please. Structures also matter. And there's a long way to go to create the empowered national and local institutions we need. And this is going to be a big challenge for an incoming Labour government. It would inherit deep economic and social policies. It will want to tackle them as quickly as possible. New ministers, most of whom have never held office before, will sit in their offices unaware that most of the levers they want to pull are not really attached to anything that is going to respond. And the whole of the union state will say to ministers, you want to get on with things, don't be diverted by devolving power or constitutional change, it's not important. And that way, of course, lies no change at all. On the other hand, a new government could not spend years on constitutional reflection. It needs to do things from day one. So what John and I propose is what we call strategic incrementalism, a series of institutional reforms that takes the UK steadily towards a new settlement. And at the heart of that, picking up on what John said, is understanding that we're in a transition from the post-war unitary British state towards something much more like a union of nations, sustained with consent by common interests. And once we understand that's the journey we're on, then we can see New Labour's devolution not in the end in itself that Labour imagined, but as a step in the journey towards a union of nations. And we need to understand the radicalism of what is needed. The mindset of the central union state, that government is best done from London by people who know what they're doing, that local government cannot be trusted and is a bit rubbish, and that devolved governments are an impertinent inconvenience to the proper management of the UK, that mindset is very deeply rooted and has been absorbed, internalized by the major political parties. So what we present as a series of manageable reforms do amount to a fundamental challenge to the culture of the central union state. Some people who've argued for Scottish independence and for the breakup of the union have argued it on the basis that the central union state cannot be reformed from within. So this is an attempt to have a strategy to prove that wrong. Now, you can discuss the order of reform, but for example, I'd suggest that three initial changes would be to delineate the government of England from that of the union. Many of our current problems stem from the fact that the union government and the government of England are one and the same, and the confusion between the two in England and outside is manifold. You'd create a machinery of government for England at civil service level with an English Secretary of State. Secondly, you'd create initially a consultative Senate of the UK in which all four nations and local government from all four nations are represented, not, note, a Senate of the devolved nations with the Union and English regions. And then you'd need to put, next slide please, the rights of national governments to make policy and shape union policy on a statutory basis, with new mechanisms for intergovernmental and national union relations. There have been some proposals in the last few days from the government to strengthen the current system, but fundamentally, they still rely on everybody playing by essentially unwritten rules. Next slide, please. At local level, and this is admittedly a very English perspective, John and I are both from England, we need to have constitutional powers for local democracy. We would argue the same principles should apply in the other nations, but the right to draw down powers and resources should be a statutory basis. Local government should reflect areas that have an identity and belonging, not be centrally imposed structures suiting a Whitehall idea of neatness. We need to enable localities to create the sub-regional and regional structures they need to tackle larger area problems like perhaps transport and energy. We need to create new partnerships between English local government and the English government. And we also need short-term action to tackle regional underfunding. Next slide, please. The point about these changes is that they will evolve over time, which is why we call it strategic incrementalism. So as you develop an English machinery of government, you then develop Westminster into a dual mandate parliament so that English MPs can properly make English domestic legislation. English ministers will become accountable to English MPs in that Westminster Parliament. You would move from a consultative UK Senate to a UK cabinet in which the first ministers of the devolved nations and the English Secretary of State would be represented, embodying the pluralism that we're talking about earlier. And longer term, and I don't underestimate the difficulties, the move towards a new UK-wide replacement fair funding formula to replace Barnett, which has both winners and losers. And of course, continuing with civil service reform. And I think we would argue from a Labour Party point of view, if we believe in the devolution of power and accountable institutions, then perhaps as a party, Labour should be based on those local government units of power rather than just on Westminster constituencies. So to move to a final slide, just one example of, I suppose, how we envisage the difference. If you look at decarbonising, our current model is essentially command and control. Policy made in Westminster, delivered through a small number of central civil servants. In that model, when you come to, for example, look at onshore wind, you find that some MPs from the governing party don't like wind farms, and so no one can have an onshore wind farm. The system obstructs the possibility of local ownership and income from renewable energy that might make such developments more palatable and more popular. So you don't get any. You want to have electric charging points. Well, that's obviously a national issue, isn't it? So we should run policy from a national level. But that's where the Treasury intervenes and prevents the funding being available. So you end up with an inadequate network. The alternative approach with empowered institutions actually enables us to run things as a partnership between empowered local institutions working on local knowledge and local leadership to identify how to make policy change popular, how to make it work, and see the challenge of resourcing as a shared national challenge rather than something that is either decided yes or no at the centre. I'm going to leave it there. I hope I've done enough to sketch out the sort of changes that we want to see and the really fundamental mindset that is needed about how Labour imagines power and how it believes it should be handled if we want to deliver the social and economic reforms that the Labour Party advocates. Back to you, Emily.
Thank you both of you. That's a really ambitious paper and I'm looking forward to discussing it. I'm going to pass over to Jessica in just a moment. I can see somebody has their hand up, Kenny Gilchrist. I'm just going to explain now that we've got a Q&A button at the bottom. So if people can post their questions in there, then we'll gather them all up and ask them at the end, if that's okay. You can also comment on other people or upvote other people's questions so we can see which ones are the most pertinent to everybody. Okay, so I'm going to now pass over to Jessica for 10 minutes commenting on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. It's a great discussion to be having. It's impossible to do the paper justice in 10 minutes. I'm just going to try and give a few thoughts, being English myself, from a kind of more local perspective and the kind of local democracy elements in the paper. Just to start off with a note of caution, it is very easy to be a radical devolutionary when you are the party of opposition, and it is much harder to pursue such an agenda when you assume power. So this is absolutely the right time for Labour to be having such a discussion, because if this is to be reality, then whenever it is that Labour does hold power, they need to enter office with a very clear agenda for change, and a real determination to understand the ends that you're working towards and to see that through. Sometimes discussions about place or devolution or constitutional reform, when led by people who are passionate about those issues, can be sort of presented as an end in themselves, rather than, I think, what this is, which is a means to an end. It's a governing as a means to achieving change in the country. It's not that we want to do constitutional reform for the sake of it. And sometimes arguments like that potentially don't capture the public's imagination if they are presented in terms that they're an end in themselves. So it's absolutely right to anchor this in an account of future challenges, where the world is, where we know the world will be going in the next decades, the big serious challenges that we have to tackle as a nation, and how the system needs to shift in order to achieve that. That also does need to be based on a serious account of what has gone right and wrong in the past, and how things need to change to achieve that. So an understanding of that history is important, but equally an awareness of what the challenges are for the future. And I like the example of decarbonising that John gave at the end of that presentation. It's clearly our climate goals are beyond any single person, any single institution, any single nation's ability to achieve on their own. But certainly it's an issue that governing institutions need to not do to people. They don't need just people's consent to act, but they also need people to be actors and positive participants themselves. So we need to think through how our governing institutions are able to kind of leverage people's action and activity and consent. At New Local, we talk a lot about the concept of community power, which I think is a really important concept in this regard. It basically refers to the understanding that people themselves have assets, capabilities and insights into their own situations. And if institutions like public services worked with them as equals rather than as professionals that do to them, but actually were able to kind of leverage their aspirations and insights, you could get more sustainable outcomes. So some of the things that are at the back of this presentation that shift from a kind of more paternalistic state model that seeks to do to rather than work with people, or a more, I guess, what's characterised our governance over possibly since the 1980s, that more kind of market transactional approach, where it's a kind of deal, or a thing, a thing that you give this and you get that back. It's quite a narrow kind of approach. I think what we've been seeing lots of different approaches over the last few years from different local government institutions, different public services, trying to find opportunities to leverage people's participation and deliberation in much different ways. That does try to understand what they want to get out of a situation and work with the grain of that much more. So I think a lot of that is at the back of this. Fundamentally, how can you work with people as equals, and how can you do that by building trust in institutions? An important thing for Labour to consider is what a future Labour government would inherit from an outgoing Conservative government. It's certainly fair to say that the concept of place has grown in recognition over the last few years. but there's no clear view of place from Whitehall. Different Whitehall departments have different definitions of places. So while you might see that there is soon to be awaited levelling up white paper that may or may not pursue some more devolution, that's one part of Whitehall's approach to place. You have another approach to place coming from health, for example, where you have ICS system reform that's not at all aligned with local democracy's view of place and local government, which is creating different frictions in different areas. And then, for example, you have LEPS, which is a whole other geography. So we have much more of a recognised concept of place, but a very kind of distorted and complex view of it, which means that when you are in the place, your view of the system, it creates complications and grappling over it. Of course, we've gone through a decade of austerity, but there are also features of how local areas are resourced. The presentation touched on fiscal powers. We are an absolute outlier for advanced Western countries in the amount of the lack of fiscal revenue raising power that local areas have, and the ability, just to kind of match investment to need locally, which does need addressing. We have a very complicated system for resourcing local areas, which makes it incredibly difficult to channel funding where it's needed and to get maximum impact for that funding. I just wanted to touch on a couple of strands of thought or kind of habits of argument within Labour that I think are a challenge to this concept of pluralism, which I think is a very good principle to be talking about and becoming comfortable with. But I think it does go against the grain of some Labour thought, or some kind of natural Labour thought, which I think we need to be cognizant of and challenge and understand that this is why a pluralist approach can achieve Labour ends. The first is that Labour tends to see that standardised, uniform approaches are the best approaches to tackling things like poverty and inequality. But inequality is so complex and so entrenched and is deepening in our country, which happens to also be one of the most centralised countries in the advanced Western world. So I think if any Labour future government in the 2020s or beyond needs to understand how to tackle inequality, by definition, it will be starting differently in different areas. Such is the extent of inequality that's linked to geographic inequality. So it needs to be much more recognised, I think, within Labour, although you would have principles of universalism and a kind of macro society approach. Actually, if you're going to effectively tackle inequality as you find it, you absolutely need a pluralist approach to governance and statecraft, and that's not to kind of mess around with principles about what everybody gets and everybody should kind of seek the same outcomes. But in order to achieve those outcomes, you might need different outputs. And the kind of postcode lottery argument is often deployed within Labour as a reason why you do need a one-size-fits-all approach. I would argue that we have the biggest postcode lottery is that of life chances, whereby where you are born has an impact on your life expectancy. This has happened despite a centralised state, and I think Labour needs to be much more appreciative of the fact that a pluralist approach can achieve some of those social justice ends. Another habit, a second one, is that I think just over the last decade of austerity, there's become a bit of a habit of having quite a zero-sum argument about place. I think this is probably characterised by the fact that within austerity, you're arguing about scarce resources and where they're best invested. John and John were hinting at it, well, I think when you were talking about this kind of the rise of grievance politics, it's very easy for anyone, but it's certainly very easy for the Labour Party to start talking in terms of north versus south, or London versus Manchester or the north, towns versus cities. This place needs this investment more, and I think that can become quite damaging and populist potentially. It's quite easy to make those arguments vis-a-vis other areas and why this area has done worse and needs more. But I think the challenge with this agenda is to foster a sense of common purpose while still acknowledging and valuing pluralism. I think that's quite high and it's quite easy. And I think Labour would need to be quite clear that it would be challenging itself to slip into that kind of zero-sum rhetoric. And then finally, there was a strand of Labour thought around this, I think, which would just seek to resurrect everything that was dismantled in 2010. So there's kind of a strand of the old regionalism is just what we need to kind of recreate. And actually, it was the dismantling of that that is the root of all our challenges on place. And I would just caution against that particular kind of strand of argument, although clearly there were some institutions that were kind of got rid of. I think the fact that there was very little public outcry for the end of the old RDAs really shows that they weren't anchored into people's identity and sense of place. A great example is the Northwest. Does anyone think they are a Northwesterner? You're a Scouse or you're a Mancunian. You know, to some extent, we might have critiques of it, but to some extent, the devolution architecture that has emerged over the last 10 years potentially does capture people's sense of their identity and place. And I think it would be harder, for example, for a future government to dismantle them, and that's kind of the test. So one of the tests for a future Labour government is to create institutions and attachment to institutions that endures beyond the life cycle of a government. And I think for now, having a good account of what worked and what worked less well in the past is a really good place to start for the future. So I really welcome this discussion. There's lots more to say, but looking forward to getting into some questions in a bit.
Great, thanks, Jessica. And there are lots of questions already coming through on the Q&A. I'm sort of trying to gather some of them up into groups, but yeah, do keep doing that. And I'm going to pass over to Philip now.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to comment on the paper. And to John and John, it's been a pleasure to be involved in the seminars over the last few months as part of this process. Just to pick out one or two of the comments made earlier on, I suppose I would describe myself as a reform bureaucrat. John, I don't mind being called a bureaucrat. That's what I was. Maybe now a reforming bureaucrat or a reforming ex-bureaucrat. So I spent a good part of my career in a devolved context in Scotland, but the last 10 years of my career in Whitehall, and actually one of my jobs early on in that work was administering the coup de grace to the RDAs, indeed, and getting the LEPs going. But for the last 7 years of my time in Whitehall, as well as dealing with Brexit, I was responsible for constitutional and devolution issues. So witnessed the coalition attempts at reform the Constitution, House of Lords and the rest of it, as well as the stuttering of the whole concept of intergovernmental relations under pressure of Brexit. I thought I could most usefully add to this conversation by looking at this suite of ideas from the perspective of how do you get them to happen, and to pay them the respect as a serious suite of ideas that an incoming Labour government may seek to implement. So what are the issues and challenges going to be in order to get these reforms into place and delivered? And I relatively briefly pick up under 4 points: the coherence of a package of reform, winning public support, the geography of dispersed power, and come back to that, Jessica's already mentioned that, but also handling and dealing with Whitehall. Start off on the coherence of the reform package. So much of constitutional reform, if we're allowed to call it that in this country over the years, has been done effectively in a piecemeal fashion. And I say that was true even of the 1997 reforms, incoming Labour government then. Despite the fact a lot went on, there was a lack of coherence to that package. And just one example of that, obviously very, very big changes in the governance of the United Kingdom in terms of devolution of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but no real change to the way in which the centre of government, Whitehall, went about its business. And to some extent, we've been dealing with the consequences of that ever since. So the importance of seeing the whole and to be able to demonstrate how each part builds to a coherent whole, and also the way in which different parts of this agenda reinforce each other. So John has mentioned the reforms to intergovernmental relations that this government has introduced just over the last week or so, welcome in their own right. This is progress in my view, but those reforms will only really be effective if there is greater accountability for the way in which they're managed. If you just leave it to the system to operate those reforms as they're written on paper, they will not make much of a difference. And I can say that having had over 7 years of managing the intergovernmental relations process in Whitehall. So how do you build it in that accountability? I would argue, for example, that you give some of that accountability via a reformed second chamber. Just in terms of the sort of coherence of all of this program as well, just I like the idea of incremental change, coherent but incremental. Though there is always a risk when you hear the word incremental, that means slow. And this sort of program, if it's going to work, needs to be done quickly and early in administration. It's the sort of thing, if left to year 2, year 3, it'll probably never happen. And certainly if it's left to the second administration or third administration, it will not happen. So getting started early, establishing the principles early, it seems to me is absolutely critical, and then allowing implementation to play out over the lifetime of an administration. So that's point one, a coherent package implemented early. Public support, this does need thought about. Reforms of this nature will be politically controversial for some, for many perhaps. There will be many vested interests who will seek to put obstacles in the road. And the more that public support can be demonstrated, the more momentum will build up around such a programme. And you can see examples of this happening. The changes that came in Scotland in the late 90s built on all that was done by the Constitutional Convention, and where Labour politicians could claim that the devolution was the settled will of the people of Scotland, and that programme advances really with really very little opposition to it, because it could demonstrate that popular support. Contrast what happened in the North East in 2004, or even in Wales in 1997, when relatively half-baked proposals never garnered that popular support, fell over in one instance, and in the other instances in Wales just got over the line, but only just. So building that popular support seems to me is absolutely critical. And people always say, oh, constitutional change, it doesn't ring people's bells. I don't agree with that if you can make it relevant to things that matter in their lives. And I think Jessica made some interesting comments on that. But one thing that is worth thinking about is, what is the role of referendums in all of this? The balance between representative and direct democracy. Do you seek to introduce referendums to confirm these changes or not? I would argue on some of quite big things like House of Lords reform, which has been proper reform, we're a century overdue for reform in the House of Lords, that a clear proposal in the manifesto could be implemented rapidly without a referendum. I think by contrast, some of the more local changes, if there's establishments of new tiers of accountability, confirmatory referendums could be quite helpful to establish their credibility. But that, I think, does need thought through. Geography of dispersed power, just very, very briefly, to say I agree with the risks in this. There will be a messy geography, that is absolutely clear, but the approach of the paper to say the principles that underpin that need to be clear, I think is the right way to go. And also the working through the postcode lottery thing, as Jessica's already mentioned, it seems to me is critical. Finally, in a way, what you might call my specialist subject, all of this dealing with Whitehall. This will be a big upheaval for Whitehall, no doubt about it. The centre of our system of government still gravitates more around the UK's place in the world than it does about the territorial governance of the United Kingdom itself. Whitehall, I would argue, has never done UK territorial governance well. The Treasury will be a particular pole of resistance and will only let go of, for example, meaningful fiscal powers to the regions of England with great reluctance. So this will require a big shift in both the culture and structures of Whitehall. No time to go into a lot of detail about that, but some points to make about dealing with that. One is this needs to be done very quickly. There's no point to come in and say, we need to think about this, you will waste a huge amount of time. It's coming in with a prescription ready to go. Need to think as part of that, shift in the incentives for both civil service and actually for ministers as well, but for civil servants, for example, in my book, nobody should be promoted to senior civil service unless they've had experience outside of Whitehall in local government, devolved government, or be what it may, but you shift the incentives, you shift the thought processes. And final point, it's the changing of the culture to emphasize that you only get things done and done well by partnership working. And that is a partnership that is cross-departmental within Whitehall. That's difficult enough, but also with the entities that hold political power outside of Whitehall, devolved administrations, regional governance, local government, and that becomes, if you like, the abiding culture of Whitehall. And moving swiftly to put in that into place will be essential to achieve the impact of these changes. Thank you. Bit of a gallop, but I hope that's some help in thinking through how you might make this happen.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks for sticking to time. Okay, so we've got a little while for questions. As I said, lots have come through, and I've also, so I've been trying to sort of sum some of those up. I guess we should go back to the two Johns now to think about some of the things that Jessica and Philip raised. So I think, basically how to implement this, how to gain public, political, and kind of bureaucratic institutional support. And I think also this question about sort of how to embed it in kind of public culture, public kind of affections, as well as in institutional ways, and about sort of devolving further down. So that's a kind of summing up of some of the things we've just heard, but some of the things that have come through on the discussion. I think broadly fall into maybe kind of four kind of categories. So one about party politics. What do we do if there are divisions between different parties being represented in different areas of the UK, particularly mentions of the SNP and Sinn Féin. Questions about kind of units and scale. So does England and Wales make sense as a unit? Is England itself too big? And how can we push down below this to people, at a kind of citizen level, not just elites? And quite a few questions about Labour, Labour's ends. Is this a means through which we could achieve kind of nationalisation at a local level? How does it fit with Labour values about sort of uniformity and uniform outcomes? And how, if at all, does it help in terms of challenging Conservative government? And then I think the final set of questions really are about consent. So, how do we gain consent? How do you gain sort of interest for this within a Labour Party which hasn't previously shown any inclination to do any of this kind of thing? And then about whether there's an opportunity represented by the current sort of breakdown of governance by convention. Is there a chance to push for a kind of written constitution now? There were some questions that have come through as I've been speaking, so I haven't summarised those, but I think that's probably enough for you to be going on with. Do you want to take just a couple of minutes each, see what you can get to out of that, and then we'll maybe take another round?
Okay, let me try, Emily. I'll just pick up a couple of points, then you perhaps drag us back onto things.
Yeah, it's a lot.
One question comes up, what if you have the SNP in Holyrood, where Labour in Wales, maybe Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, and somebody said, and the Conservatives in England? Let's just remember that's what we've got. I mean, it's the DUP in Northern Ireland, not Sinn Féin. The Conservative government of the United Kingdom exists entirely on a majority of English seats. It doesn't win in any other part of the United Kingdom. And part of our problem that we've got here is precisely that our geography and our size and our electoral system forces an English elected government onto the whole of the United Kingdom. Now, the reality is we've got to find a way of if we want to kind of treat the union together, in which you say it is legitimate for different parts of the union to elect different political parties if they wish to do so. We absolutely need to stop an English elected government simply saying, as the current government does with its muscular unionism, well, we've won because there are more seats in England, so we get to tell everybody else what to do. That's what's tearing the union apart at the moment. But the aim of this proposal is to, as far as you can, build in the principle of respect for people winning elections. And the idea, in a sense, I mean, Northern Ireland, we may need to do some more work because the Northern Ireland system actually produces a bipartisan leadership in Northern Ireland, not with necessarily great effectiveness all of the time. And maybe our proposals are oversimplified, but trying to prevent Northern Ireland being represented within our proposed UK cabinet or even a Senate before that because they elect the wrong people is not a way that's going to keep the union together. The second point related to that is a question about England. I think it's this. Delineating the English government, machinery of government from the union government is essential because this confusion between a government with a majority in England and the government of the union is a real problem. The argument for England is not that England just needs to operate at national level, but it does have separate policy across the whole range of domestic policy, implemented not by English institutions, but by a union institution. Separating out the two is the key to getting the devolution within England, which is necessary. One of the reasons we don't get devolution in England is there's nothing at the centre, which is an English government to devolve power from. So actually the two go hand in hand. Creating an English machinery of government and ultimately representation in Parliament and devolving power within England are two sides of the same coin. They're not separate challenges.
John, did you want to come in on anything?
Yeah, sorry, there's a comment from sort of, I guess the kind of hardest opposition to what we're talking about came from Rhys Pugh in the comments, you know, talking about, you know, the idea of sort of Labour as this a party committed to sort of placeless, uniformity, equality, let's say, and that, you know, kind of there's, you know, examples of societies where there is sort of, you know, seemingly kind of a devolution of power, Bosnia or wherever, which are kind of sort of continually in deadlock. And I just wanted to sort of confront, you know, if you like, confront those sort of arguments, which have a really strong resonance within the kind of Labour movement, you know, kind of head on in two ways. Firstly, you know, I don't think Labour's ever been committed to, let's put it this way, Labour's never been non-national. The nation has always been part of what Labour's been about, whether it's a British nation at some moments or kind of, you know, or England, Scotland, kind of Wales, etc. You know, so there's a constant, you know, sort of relationship between forms of national belonging at different levels and the Labour Party, and which you know, so there's never been the kind of disavowal of place that kind of is important for various kind of communist traditions or whatever, which within the Labour movement, other than in, I think, a kind of sort of minority of places. So in kind of talking about place and in talking about locality and in talking about nation, we're kind of connecting you know, to a really rich vein of sort of thinking, you know, kind of on the left, you know, and we're arguing that you can talk about locality and nation without that necessarily being conservative, without it necessarily being, you know, kind of something that is sort of nationalistic in the traditional way we use that term, etc., and is compatible with pluralism. You know, an early argument that, you know, sort of Labour, you know, kind of nationalists made in the early 20th century was in favour of anti-colonial, you know, independence for parts of empire, saying that we're England, we're Britain, we're self-governing, and other parts of the world should have the same rights as nations that we do. So I just kind of that sort of politics of place has always been a part of, or has been powerful within Labour's tradition at various places. And I'd argue that deadlock happens where you have the idea of absolute power, where there is a kind of winner takes all approach to power. That's where you have deadlock, because the reality, of course, is the winner can never take all. There's always countervailing forces. And so what we're talking about is moving from a scenario in which, you know, Scotland imagines it can get what it wants, or Scottish nationalists think they can get what they want from independence, you know, British muscular unionists and the Tory party think that they can get what they can, want by simply annihilating Scotland, a Scottish autonomy, if you like. And we're saying, actually, and that's what leads to deadlock. That's what leads to chaos. And what we're saying is actually, no, if you recognise the multiplicity of the centres of power within the UK, which is just our argument is you reckon this is reality. This is actually how most people see themselves, how Britain really is. Then we can get things done because we recognise that we need to have a conversation, we need to have a discussion, and we need to have a dialogue. And that, so that connects just quickly to a second point, which is how Alan Finlayson and other questions about how do we get this to happen. This is not something that Labour within its kind of tradition has or recently has really kind of seen as important. I think that kind of Jessica mentioned that sometimes devolution and the language you mentioned, you note that the word devolution doesn't exist within our paper, or at least within these slides, and that's deliberate. Kind of when we people who support kind of sort of radical constitutional reform in terms of kind of localizing power, etc. It becomes an end in itself. It becomes an obsession, and also it's often seen as reforming Britain. And I think our point is that actually this is about how you can couch this in terms of getting things done. You can couch it in terms of actually being more effective. Just simply, and that's about running with the grain, if you like, of what the UK is now, which is a highly unequal, geographically dispersed society in which people have very strong sense of local and national belonging, and that our politics needs to reflect, kind of that reality. So I think that the final element of how do we get Labour to make this happen is we organise. Actually, to be honest, is that it's the hard work of politics. That if there's enough of us who think that this is needed, then we need to be making the case in a kind of Labour-friendly language. Kind of not doing so in seeing this as an end in itself, but connecting it to broader Labour goals, and just do what anyone does when they try and get any kind of political objective to achieve any kind of political objective. But the point is, I think Jessica pointed out, is to connect this this is not in a sense an end in itself, but it's linked to, well, how do we create an effective polity and a socially just polity?
Thank you both. So there were quite a few more questions, a few really kind of about this question about place and people's kind of attachment to place, and how that is difficult to kind of align with a plan, however kind of laudable, coming out from the middle. So lots of questions about different parts of England, a question about whether we should be promoting more ancient places like Wessex and Mercia. I'm going to leave you to think about those. As I said, I'm going to have to scoot off in a minute, but what I thought we might do is ask maybe Philip first and then Jessica to come back on some of the points that you've heard, and then pass back to the two authors for a final word, if that's suitable for everybody. Thank you so much. It's been great, and I'm sorry to have to leave before the end.
Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Emily. Just to pick up the bat and then briefly on some of those comments, clearly any shift of this sort of scale and magnitude will require more political actors from different political backgrounds working together. This happens more than we sometimes recognise, and certainly at local government level. We've also, people forget this, we've had coalition governments in this country. We might look back to the last coalition government, 5 years of relative political stability in many ways. But and if you look at opinion polls, I know these best from the Scottish context where I live, but if you look at what people want, they want the governments that represent them to work together. If you look at what happens behind the scenes, if you look what happened through COVID, for example, despite all of the political barney at the top political level, there is a huge amount of day-to-day collaboration between administrations because it is necessary to get things done. So I absolutely agree with what John Wilson said about the importance of this for the effective delivery of policy. And it is about challenging the political process to be grown up enough to be able to work together to deliver those outcomes, recognising, of course, that there will always be differences of view on what the direction of travel is. Just to pick up a couple of other points on this vexed question of how do you manage the dispersal of power within England. As someone as you'll gather from my accent, didn't grow up in Scotland, and have wondered about independence for Yorkshire from time to time as a good Yorkshire-born lad. But that responding to people's sense of identity, it seems to me, is absolutely critical, and that's where the bureaucrats have got it wrong in the past, because they've gone with economic or administrative geographies. They've not gone with geographies of identity. That's why it gets messy, because English identity around regions is obviously varies from place to place. But this is doable if you follow the principles that John and John have set out of having that sort of coherent underpinning set of principles. And finally, just on England itself, the reality, as John Denham described, is of a Whitehall where a good number of departments in effect are departments for England. They have very little to do with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the failure of our mechanisms to recognise that, I think, is part cause of the discontent in England about governance in the United Kingdom, but is also a part cause of the incoherence in governance across the UK. And I think biting that bullet, recognising that that needs to be addressed, is essential if we're to get a more coherent system of government for the UK as a whole.
Nice.
Just to pick up on a few points before handing back to you, John, if that's okay. It's been a great discussion. I was looking through the questions, and it's impossible to kind of do justice to everything, but hopefully it feels like this is a debate that's very much just kicking off now. Just to kind of reflect on a couple of points. I think one word that you did use, which I don't often find used in these discussions, is the word culture. And culture is so important, yet it is impossible to legislate for directly or kind of mandate, but it absolutely plays a role in enabling something to happen or blocking things to happen. And I think understanding how our system works and the culture and behaviours that our system creates. I mean, you can look currently at the kind of whatever today's news is bringing, but culture of how Westminster operates, whether it's the whip's offices or beyond. There's a much more scrutiny about how we are governed, and much more, I think, public appetite for an understanding that it kind of works on our side, and an understanding that the culture is a healthy and non-toxic culture. But I do think that then kind of has manifestations in terms of how we think of Whitehall culture. We have a very top-down, centralised culture of doing government. John Wilson was mentioning how the kind of winner takes all, first past the post system means that we have a culture of, within our political parties, of kind of seeking power and then inhabiting it, and then how you kind of then make decisions beyond that. It is very oppositional and very binary. I think if we began to see our democratic sphere as more of a kind of process and an ongoing process, rather than, I think, probably the traditional representative democracy leads you to think that democracy is a one-off event. It is a vote that you're kind of stuck with the effects of for the next 5 years, or a referendum where you're stuck with the effects of for however long afterwards. We have these kind of binary approach to how we do politics. We're seeing a lot of really interesting stuff going on in local government, where councils are taking on citizens' assemblies to try and look in a much more deliberative way, to try and involve people in a different way in some of the big thorny issues that present themselves. We're seeing much more kind of participative opportunities for ongoing micro decisions, but on an ongoing basis. So I think part of this, we need to think, what's the ask of people? How are we bringing government closer to people? How are we seeing democracy as something that happens on an ongoing basis. It's a process rather than a one-off event, and that requires people to participate in a very different way. And I think that's part of the background to all of this, is how you build trust in institutions, and moving away from a model that just expects the experts inhabit the institutions and they make the decisions on our behalf. I think is really important. Another thing that's at the back of this is just our resilience as a state. We've obviously been through a pandemic. The effects of it are ongoing. One of the things we've seen from experiencing the COVID crisis is there's a real lack of connectivity between different layers of government. That's one of the things I quite like about this paper that you're presenting, is it's about spheres of influence and how they kind of interact with each other. It's not about just saying, oh, there's a centralized country, or we need to devolve power locally, and that it's one thing or the other. It's actually also about how these spheres of our democracy and spheres of our governance interact with each other and coordinate. And when you see something like a pandemic happening and an instant kind of response from the centre that's massively decoupled from the public health response in local areas, you can see how kind of unresilient that makes us as a country. And I think one of the things to really kind of keep a hold of on this is, what are the future threats that our country faces, and how fit for purpose are our governing institutions to those ends, quite apart from what does Labour want to achieve in government. And I think it's that focus on what we know about future challenges and how we need to be fit for purpose that I think we need to kind of keep coming back to in a lot of all of this.
Thanks very much indeed, Jessica, and Philip also for taking part. If I say a couple of things, then I'll pass back to John to close it. But thanks to everybody who's been on the call and for some great questions. If I could just pick up a few of those. Alan Finlayson's question about how you get the Labour Party to think like this. In part, it simply has to be challenging people to say how on earth they're going to deliver the reforms they want to deliver if they don't govern in this way. If Labour comes in with its ambitions of change and tries to govern with the existing machinery of government, it will fail. It might well fail to keep the union together. It will certainly fail to tackle inequality and poverty and the other problems that we have been talking about. The second thing is about popularising, and I think that is partly about understanding where the public is. It's quite interesting to see the comments about England and English votes for English laws in the chat. Actually, there's one constitutional reform policy that has always had a majority of English voters supporting it for 20 years in every single opinion poll, and that is that England's laws should be made by England's MPs. Every single poll that's ever been done. And actually, reform to the governance of England at a national level is always more popular than devolution of powers within England, whether we like that or not. And so actually, the sort of things that we've talked about in the paper for England go with the flow of public opinion. The trick then is to enable institutions at local level to grow and build their popularity in the way that Philip was talking about, which is why we put the emphasis on the right of local areas to draw down powers. It's a right to enable areas to build their own institutions which reflect localities and popularity, and then govern in those much broader ways, which we don't touch on the paper, which Jessica's brought into the discussion about how you use that power if you're an empowered local institution. So I think if we think both about what Labour needs to do to be successful and how you go with the grain of public opinion, the elements are there. I just picked one slightly different point. It was raised by somebody who was asking, does this open the door to different approaches to nationalisation and so on? And to an extent, once you start like this, you do come up with different solutions. And I live in Winchester here. Southern Water, more or less on a daily basis, tips raw sewage into our rivers and our sea, and we pay for the privilege of doing that. I mean, a model where Southern Water came under, in some way, social control of the local authorities and people living in southern England is probably much more attractive to me than the idea of the old state nationalisation that we had previously. It's not necessarily part of our paper, but once you start saying what are the powers that should lie with more local institutions, it certainly opens the door to that different way of approaching questions. And a similar question was raised about who gets to control the health service in these models. Once you start thinking about a right to devolve power, then different places might come up with different solutions to the problems that they have that meet local needs. But I'll leave it with there and back to John.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for the questions. I just wanted to make a couple of comments and follow on really from John's discussion just there about growing growing powers that already exist. I think there's a danger, and I think lots of discussion of English regions fit into this kind of category, but not only just a discussion of English regions, of a very incredibly abstract approach to government, where sort of you get out a map and you kind of like sort of think about what the best kind of theoretical units of government are or whatever, and that's what governments have done. In fact, kind of over the second half of the 20th century, we've had kind of the reorganization of local government at various moments. Lots of debates about what the kind of sort of the most appropriate scale is to have different units. And that kind of approach, I think in some ways is part of the problem that we're trying to critique. It's to say that, kind of it's very top down, and it forgets that, I guess one of the central points, at least for me, of what we're trying to say here, which is let's start with Britain as it is. Let's start with where people identify, but also where the institutions lie that actually do stuff. One of the real tragedies for me of COVID and the response to COVID was, and I think lots of, this is Labour's, Labour Party, Keir Starmer was very critical of this, and it's a very good point, was that the central government reinvented lots of institutional mechanisms for distributing PPE, for procuring stuff from the mate to the Tories or whoever, where actually there were powers that already existed, that could have been grown, that could have been connected, that could have been better funded. We had sort of local authority, health authority, public health staff, etc. Kind of, and so for me, for us, it's a question of, rather than kind of, and this is sometimes the problem with the way in which we talk about reform and kind of the reform of our polity, rather than starting in the centre and saying, well, where is the best place for power to lie? We look at where power does lie, and where there is the greatest kind of support and the greatest sort of where communities are the strongest attached to particular bits of government or particular institutions, and then we kind of talk about empowering those places. Connects to Jessica's point about community power rather than kind of simply local government. I think it's important that you don't have a rhetoric of community power that is about undermining local government. I mean, often in some quarters there's a whole conversation about, well, if you give power to councils, that's just giving power to another set of bureaucrats rather than central government. And local authorities are elected, they're democratic, and they're what we have. So you can't just abolish them and replace them with the voluntary sector. But kind of you need to acknowledge that kind of power is dispersed and does live in all these different places. So our approach very much is about it's kind of, to some degree, I was going to say small c conservative. It's at least it's about saying, well, where does power lie that is accountable and that is can be grown, and through time, those kind of powers that exist, through the country, local authority, etc., may decide to kind of sort of to merge, to kind of share resources, and to grow. And that's where English regions may grow, may come into existence. They are coming to existence to some degree already through a kind of, if you like, that kind of piecemeal bottom-up approach. But if we simply try and kind of imagine the polity in this kind of abstract bureaucratic way, it's almost as if, I'm a historian of India, kind of like we partitioned Britain, in the same way that the bureaucrats did, and they were bureaucrats, in 1947. That's simply not going to work. So I think that's kind of going back to another point that Jessica made, which is that culture is central here. Kind of this is, kind of it's about saying we need to map out institutional changes and have real policies and say, yes, we do need a Senate, yes, we do need a cabinet that it's constituted differently, and we do need kind of to make this kind of distinction between English government and UK-wide government and so forth. But culture and language is crucial, and the kind of vocabulary that we use to talk about different parts of the polity, and trying to persuade Labour people to use that different language, to talk more about partnership, to talk about working with different parts of the country, to kind of talk about the UK as a society of different places in a really tangible way rather than in an abstract way. That shift is important. And I think the only way we can, we need to kind of model that ourselves, I think, and then sort of, try and get Labour politicians to kind of be talking in a different way about how they get things done, and then, really sort of holding to account on that. Finally, our moment now. And there's a danger of being too optimistic about the kind of possibilities of crisis always. Moments that you think of a crises have a tendency not to lead to the kind of changes that we would hope them to lead to. We are living through a crisis, obviously, in terms of government in every possible way. but I'm kind of optimistic. I'm optimistic about the kind of possibilities that exist within the current crisis of government, more than other moments. And a couple of things. The moment when actually kind of leading politicians, it's in the interests of leading politicians to do local properly and to kind of articulate their own position as local leaders or leaders of kind of city regions or whatever, rather than simply speaking on behalf of this kind of vaguely defined kind of nation. So Andy Burnham, who's an extremely ambitious politician, he wants to be leader of the Labour Party, he wants to be Prime Minister. He made a move, kind of to say, I'm going to be kind of leader of Greater Manchester, and then articulated locally, kind of a sort of a local stroke regional kind of argument, to sort of buttress his kind of sense of power there. And I'm sure he still has kind of ambitions to come back to kind of Westminster, but he's sort of articulated all sorts of things that are about the need to kind of sort of have a different way of thinking about the UK polity, that he would find it extremely hard to go back on, even if he was sort of inclined to do so. So I think there's a number of moments like that where actually kind of we live now in a political moment where actually it is in the interests of politicians to make the case for the pluralism of the UK polity. Kind of not Scottish Labour yet, it seems, unfortunately, but at some point even that's going to have to happen, and Scottish Labour will realise that they can actually win if they start talking about Scotland. So look at what's happened to the Welsh Labour Party. The Welsh Labour Party, has Leighton and people on the call here, kind of the Welsh Labour Party is kind of making a case for its kind of for itself as the leader of a Welsh nation, for place, and it's done well by doing that. So I think I'm kind of optimistic actually that kind of that there are forces within Labour that actually are meaning that because Britain is so dispersed and unequal geographically, kind of it's in the interests of politicians to kind of sort of make the kind of case for the kind of polity that we're talking about. I wanted to kind of end on a moment of optimism. But shall I guess it's really left for me to say thank you to everybody, I suppose. So thanks to Philip, Jessica, for Emily for chairing, for Sophie for kind of putting things, organising and doing the slides, and and it's been a pleasure working with John and everybody else on this. And thanks to such a great audience. It's a shame it's impossible to kind of see people and to sort of have a real conversation, but this is a real conversation, but it's all a little bit disembodied. But thanks for everyone's great questions and great engagement, and we'll be in touch with the next steps on this, because this obviously is not the end of this project. So thank you, everybody. Anything else to add from any of the panelists?
Quickly, next Wednesday, 2nd of February, James Meadway on the political economy of England. If you haven't been sent an invitation, look on the Centre for English Identity and Politics